Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 3rd of January, 2025. Let's get started. So today we're sitting down and talking to Dr. John Klein again. Dr. Klein is a senior fellow and strategist focusing on space policy and space warfare. He teaches at George Washington University in D.C., and has recently come out with the second edition of his book, Space Warfare, looking at strategy, principles, and policy in space. Now, with the massive growth in the privatization of space activities, and with the return of the Trump administration to the White House, who created the American Space Force as a military branch, very timely to re-examine this topic and look at what the future of space warfare and space policy is. Now, really excited to have this opportunity to talk to Dr. Klein again. There will be a link to his book in the show notes. Please go check it out. With that, let's get to John.
All right. Well, hey, John, welcome back to the podcast. How you doing this afternoon, sir?
I'm doing well, Scott. Great to be back on your show.
So we're here to talk about your book and space warfare and all things space. And I just got to ask, how close are we to Star Wars?
We are very far off, but that's okay. It's we're doing competition, but no big battleships or alien beings coming down anytime soon, and definitely no planet-destroying Death Stars as yet.
Are we at least like within a decade of getting the transporter from Star Trek to replace DoorDash?
Well, probably not a transporter, but we have some commercial companies doing some wonderful things with reusable launch that looks pretty cool. And I will say I am optimistic that the next few years we will start seeing commercial missions to Mars.
Now, you recently came out with a second edition of your book, Space Warfare. The original one, I believe, was published, it came out in December 2005. Tell us, why is it you felt the need to update this edition? What may have happened in the past 20 years to cause a re-examination on why space matters?
You know, everything has changed in some sense. So yeah, like you mentioned, it's been 20 years. I wrote my first paper, which was called Corbett in Orbit, while I was at the Naval War College as a student there, using the framework of maritime strategy by Julian Corbett. At the time when I wrote it, you know, there was no Space Force. There was no consideration that space was a warfighting domain. This idea that space was somehow special or a sanctuary was kind of the main model. We used space for treaty verification with the former Soviet Union. We had exquisite satellites for intelligence collection, but we really didn't have a large commercial sector, and we didn't really have proliferated low Earth orbit constellations. But, you know, it's changed now. You know, we openly say space is a warfighting domain. We talk about competition and crisis with China and Russia. We have China doing direct descent hit-to-kill anti-satellite testing. We have India. We have open source reporting that Russia is considering deploying a nuclear weapon in space. So the mindset of space has changed a lot. You know, that's the academic side. And honestly, as a researcher, my understanding has changed a lot in the last 20 years. So when the publisher gave me the opportunity to have a second edition, I wanted to correct some things that had changed and right some wrongs.
When you started trying to conceptualize space and lay out a framework for how other policymakers and academics and military practitioners should understand space, why did you go with adapting naval doctrine to space warfare? Because very obviously, like, one's got a lot of water, one's got no water, one's down on Earth, one's up in the sky. So how does this doctrine from way back in the day, one of the oldest realms of competition that we've seen in the interstate system, apply to miles and miles above the Earth's surface with completely different technologies?
Yeah. So I could give you the short answer that in Star Trek they use naval ranks, but that would be insufficient for your audience. So why the maritime environment? Why naval strategy and the like? So that that's an important question because much of our current space power doctrine was taken from air power theory and air power doctrine, and they just sought to replace air with space, and that's very deficient. So why maritime? Because there's this fundamental paradox, is what I wrote about in my first edition, that at the strategic level of war, where we consider why states compete or why they would have conflict, the maritime and space domains are more similar. But at the tactical level, when you consider the technology required, air domain and space domain are more similar. So, if you're looking for enduring principles for considering warfare in the space domain, it's best to take on a maritime approach. So we have distance lines of communication at sea, and we have those in space. And what's different in the land domain, whenever we have opposing armies meeting on the field of battle, those lines of communication ran pretty much internal to those countries that were fighting. In the maritime domain, it's a lot different. So they're kind of shared. So you can't impact your adversary without potentially impacting yourself. Just like if you laid mines in the maritime domain, they may impact your shipping. If you cause debris generating events in space, that may impact you. As we're seeing in Ukraine now, we have widespread GPS jamming on both sides that is causing interference with belligerents, commercial, civil, and everybody else nearby. We have strategic positions, just like in space and the maritime domain, choke points of consideration, and the strategy of the offense and defense. It's important when you use a maritime analogy to not overplay your hand. All analogies break down because they're based on a specific time and place. So the art side is knowing when to use maritime strategy and then when to maybe bring in some other theories.
You mentioned a couple things there. When I hear choke points as a former ground guy, I think very specific, definable terrain features on the ground that limit freedom of maneuver on the ground. Space seems like, unless you run into an asteroid or bounce off the moon, that's not up there. So what are choke points in space? How is that even possible?
Yeah, so we have, just like you mentioned in land warfare, we do have physical features. So we have launch positions. So we have maybe 2 to 3 primary launch locations in the United States. We have Florida, we have California, and then we have commercial companies launching out of South Texas. We have low Earth orbit. Again, it's a region. We have different orbits above the Earth, but we have 90% of all our satellites are in low Earth orbit. So this is an altitude range, and we also have the International Space Station there. We have Lagrange points where any from a physics point of view, any two bodies, there's an equilibrium and gravitational pull. So we have Earth, Sun, Lagrange points, and then Earth, Moon Lagrange points, and they have special scientific features. But where the analogy breaks down, and it has to be expanded upon, is we also have choke points in the electromagnetic spectrum. These are frequency bands that are more highly desirable. This has to do with atmospheric attenuation from satellites that are sending their signals down to terrestrial forces or for commercial users. So again, it's important to see that it includes the physical, the things that you can see and touch, and then also spectrum. And that's how, basically satellites are useless, just chunks of hardware until they get their signals and their data down for us to use.
Your point about spectrum is very astute. And I think it's an underappreciated aspect of this whole domain. Because, we had a saying in the Army, if you can't talk to your higher headquarters, all you're doing is camping in the woods, and you don't get paid to go camping in the woods. But anything you do in space is only valuable, even if it has a weapon system doing kinetic strike, if it can communicate and pass data traffic to something else, which all happens in RF spectrum. So, in cellular technology here on the ground, we have mobile network operators that get auction spectrum from different governments, and there's a regulatory body, country by country, a whole industry around it. How do we control spectrum in space, or how are we using it right now? And how does that immediately dovetail into cyber warfare and electronic warfare?
Oh, wow. two very important interrelated questions. So first, on the spectrum side, we do have an international body that regulates spectrum use. It's the International Telecommunications Union, and they'll do geostationary slots, the slots that DirecTV uses, and these satellite communications that are just stay stationary over the Earth and just beam their signals down. So they also control spectrum for low Earth orbit, which is where, again, we have thousands and thousands of satellites. So, the spectrum is allocated to individual countries, and then those countries will allocate to the users. In the United States, we have the FCC is in charge of spectrum allocation. Again, sometimes they auction off some of the more desirable spectrum or bandwidths. When we looked at 5G, there was some potential interference with GPS users as they looked to include, I think it was the C-band in that. So the second point of your question is an important one. It has to do with the intersection of space and cyberspace. This is something that is generally not well appreciated. We'll just go, the fundamental theoretical underpinnings is when Corbett was writing his maritime strategy, he talked about the intersection of the land and sea. So maritime strategy recognized both. Just in the space domain, we have to recognize the intersection of space and cyberspace. The ground segment, those are your networks, your ground stations, your link, informational domain, network dimension. At times, space warfare and cyber warfare may be one and the same. And we saw this in the opening stages of Ukraine. The day before Russian invasion of Ukraine, they attacked the California commercial company Viasat via a cyber attack. And they're looking to diminish some of the military command and control of Ukrainian forces. So this is a case where, we saw cyberspace and space operations, or the effects, as a precursor to terrestrial operations. So there's some important lessons there. It's a working hypothesis that this is very significant. I'm encouraging my students to explore these in their papers. But I think there's a there. Maybe what we're going to see is we're going to see military actions in the space domain. Maybe they'll result in an effect or a reaction in the cyberspace domain. Again, it's something that we need to consider.
So what you just brought up there, you have this foreign actor targeting civilian infrastructure in a country that's not directly participating in ground hostilities. So Russia versus Ukraine ends up targeting infrastructure in America based off of RF requirements going into space and how that affects their operations on their side of the planet, even though we're not direct combatants. How does this,
That's right.
this emergence of space, how does it complicate the relationship between military infrastructure and civilian infrastructure? Because historically, if you take the maritime analogy, countries had very large merchant fleets that were state-owned. They had very large navies that were state-owned, and it took a long time for that to become transferred into the private sector, and really only saw it at scale post-World War II in the era of liberal hegemony. You have all this privatization of shipping absent military involvement from state actors. God bless the U.S. Navy for securing the world's waterways and making all that happen, even in the Cold War. And I hate to say anything nice about the Navy, but there it is. It hurts me, but it's got to be said.
Thanks.
But we have this competition emerging in space where we take that as the norm, but really it's a historical exception. So how does this emerging competition in space highlight the tension between military capacities and civilian infrastructure as tools of state power?
Yeah, there's two areas that are very germane to this, and the maritime experience has some bearing, but not a whole lot. And that has to do with the role of proxies and proxy war. So this is an idea that goes back millennia. If I don't have a military fighting force, but I have deep pockets, I am going to procure those fighting forces somewhere else. Sometimes we call those mercenaries or the like. So countries that don't have their own capability may procure the commercial services of space companies. And, in the U.S., it's important to realize not all countries are going to share our same values with regards to privacy, the law of armed conflict, and what we consider the Western view of right and wrong. So you may have some third-party entities acting as proxies in conflict in the space domain. We could call them private military companies, whatever it is. As you're aware, and a lot of your listeners, private military companies are big business, and money always seems to find a way. Well, we see a Wagner Group in space or whatever it is. But if I don't have something that can coerce another satellite in space, maybe I'll procure that from a third party. The other part is we're seeing hybrid architectures in space. So what a hybrid architecture is, I have a governmental system, and then I have a commercial system, and we're looking to use commercial innovation, the economies of scale, and we want to say we're going to have a hybrid architecture where we blend or intermingle these two assets. It sounds great. It says, well, it provides a deterrent effect because it's hard to separate the two. I have so much capacity. So the questions legal scholars are asking is, are we making it more difficult for our adversaries to discriminate between the military object and the non-military? What we see playing out in the Middle East right now is there's an open conversation. How do you apply force to take out the military object but protect the damage and the injury to civilians and civilian infrastructure? So on the West, this is an important consideration. And then the third aspect is I want to flip it for our folks in uniform. We know Putin has said that Starlink is an extension of the United States, implying that it's a legitimate military target. Is the U.S. and Western liberal democracies willing to go after the commercial capabilities of rivals and of third-party providers? Again, this is this gray area. History suggests in the Age of Sail, when we had privateers and pirates, it was a political decision. Depends on how bad you are losing, whether you consider those illegal actions or not.
With more and more commercial capabilities moving into space and more of our infrastructure down here on the ground relying on ubiquitous connectivity provided by overcoming the tyranny of distance by putting stuff up in space where you equalize that access across the board, are we approaching a point of moral hazard with the ethics involved in the transfer of technologies to foreign actors? We take globalization for granted, especially in the post-World War II era, but as we move into space, are the risks associated with the proliferation of that technology going to put us back into more regional alignments and really tamp down globalization as we know it today?
I probably don't have a satisfactory answer. I think the trend is going to continue, and in some way, so much of the tech transfer is happening right now. We have dual-use technology. I don't know if it's going to impact or lead to any unintended consequences in the globalization or proliferation of space-based technology that can be used for ballistic missile technology or nefarious actions on space. Again, to a silly sci-fi reference, Star Wars, we have the Trade Federation. We are seeing commercial companies in space that are so powerful and they're acting together. Maybe they are a supra-governmental entity. They are acting outside of our state legal regimes, outside the UN Charter and the like. We say commercial companies that we have to register them per the launching state. I think we all know certain billionaires that are passionate about space, and if they post something or make a comment or get involved, it can have profound effects. And I know on the U.S. side, some of our allies worry that U.S. companies are becoming so powerful that they're minimizing the role of governments. Governments do have a hook. They have to register and allow the licensing for commercial providers to provide those services to Europe, Japan, South Korea. So if you have an issue, you can take it up that way. Will it cause a breakdown in our current way of doing business internationally? Potentially. I do think the trend is for commercial companies to become even more powerful. Maybe we'll consider them a monopoly, at least some of them, and have to break
a company
them apart.
like SpaceX and capability like Starlink, on a technological level, it's absolutely a national asset as it stands right now. But as you're hinting at or getting at a political level, as far as inviting military action and expanding military conflict, it seems like it's potentially a huge risk to allow those things, even though incredibly innovative and forward-looking, really inspirational what they're doing with that technology and what they're pulling off. How do we obviously there's a risk, it needs to be managed. How do we think about managing the risk posed by those innovations existing out in the wild?
Yeah, so Starlinks can kind of have close to 10,000 satellites in their proliferated low Earth orbit constellation. They're providing some great benefits. We saw this after Hurricane Helene, when we didn't have cellular phone service or really have a lot of power infrastructure. Terminals were brought in so folks could have connectivity. I know in some parts of the U.S. and the world, that's the only way that they can get internet connectivity is via satellite. There's some downsides. And I hinted at the beginning, we have 90% of our satellites in low Earth orbit. A lot of those are Starlink constellations. So if you make a orbital regime more congested, the threat of conjunctions, we call them collisions, conjunctions, but this idea of cascading debris. So we need to be cognizant because a lot of other countries are all trying to go for the same altitude assignment. What isn't regulated are the altitude assignments. Spectrum's allocated and then monitored by the International Telecommunications Union, but you could have what's going on right now is a land grab in low Earth orbit. First come, first serve, just plink your stuff up there, get a licensing. On the competition side, China has aspirations to have 3 different proliferated low Earth orbit constellations competing with Starlink, and they have said open source that their desire is to put Starlink out of business. This would be through government subsidies, undercutting the price point and just driving it to the bottom. So international competition plays out in all regimes, even in space and among commercial companies and quasi-commercial companies, which is what most of China's commercial entities
they want to replicate the playbook they did with Huawei in the telecommunications industry. That sounds
exactly
like it would be awesome for everyone. Jesus Christ. Okay, too many thoughts in my head. Moving on. So when it comes to, we talk about competition among states and some of the issues with space technology, but what sort of capabilities are we looking at the United States developing to actually use the space domain in great power competition in a high-end war with China, Russia, Iran, pick your bad guy du jour? What tools are we actually putting up there, either offensively or defensively, to assist in that type of kinetic engagement?
All right, so this is where things get a little touchy because we have to use some words, talk around stuff, because that can get the space community. A lot of this national security stuff is not unclassified or open source. So I can talk to some of the stuff about what rivals are doing. But the good news, I know, and again, it goes back to this idea that space is not special. It's just wonderfully different. We talk about weapons and all the other domains, but there's good news. So earlier this week, the U.S. Space Force came out with documentation for, as far as I can tell, is the first time that they've used the terminology weapons system with regards to Space Force capabilities. We use this weird terminology counter space capabilities, which was it was like left over from the air domain. Not very helpful. But we're talking about weapon systems, offense and defense plays. So on the defense, on deterrence by denial of benefit, that has to do with so much capability, different orbitologies, proliferated LEO. I could have commercial providers. I can use allies. So having a deep bench of capabilities, that's the defense. The offense on the U.S. side, we don't really talk about that in an open forum, but there is increasing talk. China and Russia, there's some great threat reports put out by Secure World Foundation and the Center for Strategic International Studies annually, and even the Defense Intelligence Agency puts out a nice threat report. But this idea of movement and maneuver, again, an age-old idea in land warfare and irregular warfare, but we're seeing the need for sustained maneuverability of satellites. Historically, we've let Kepler motion around the Earth kind of take over. There was a little bit of propellant, but now there's this idea of, on the U.S. side, of dynamic space operations or a maneuver without regret. So maybe the thinking is we need refueling depots in space, kind of like how we had fueling trucks for tanks and all the other landing craft. We have in-flight refueling in aviation, and we refuel ships at sea. So maybe there needs to be a refueling capability so you can have this dynamic maneuverability for your space capabilities, whether they're used offensively or defensively. A lot of, honestly, space weapons, we say they're space weapons, but they're really terrestrially based. We have direct ascent hit-to-kill ASATs that are launched from the Earth and impact the satellite on orbit. And then we have ongoing jamming and lasing, which can be terrestrially based, which isn't really technically sophisticated. That technology's been around for many decades.
How would, we've seen, with, getting back to maritime analogy, blockades and tariffs and trade embargoes and all these sorts of things used as a, below the threshold of armed conflict tool of national power to coerce nations into acquiescing to our will. What would that look like in the space domain? How does a tit-for-tat escalation play out?
Yeah, excellent. You bring up the point about the maritime strategy. So Julian Corbett, he talks about using threatening the adversary's trade, sea commerce, for deterrent effect. So it's like, I will impact your trade at sea to have an impact on shaping your decision calculus on land. To your point, how would that apply to space? Could we threaten services? That would, all our launch capability right now on the U.S. side is commercial. It's SpaceX, it's United Launch Alliance, and those are our two primary ones. So Europe has Ariane and the others. So could we withhold allowing countries to have access to space? Potentially, we could use that in a national security. If there's a times of conflict, U.S. companies have to give priority to the United States national security community to get payloads in orbit. That would probably have some ripple effects in the short term for any extended conflict. It could be withholding satellite communication services. Again, this wouldn't be probably governments doing that. This would have to be commercial companies. So that goes back to your point, are commercial companies going to act collectively to withhold? I think we saw in Ukraine where commercial entities were acting with a social conscience. So I'm not going to provide services to Russian forces for my services if they're killing people in Ukraine. So you might see it that way. An embargo, a barrier, a blockade in space is going to look very much different than what it looks terrestrially, just because of the nature of the economics and how
Is there a way to do an embargo with space? I suppose you could keep people from launching new stuff up there, but is there a way to embargo them from actually taking advantage and employing the tools that they already have in place?
It would be difficult. You could potentially shoot down everything. That would be
I feel like that's a step beyond
right?
embargo. Embargoes usually stop shy of the...
Yeah. I don't know how you would, because the commercial companies will put, if you're a South American country, Brazil or Panama, and you want to have a satellite, you're going to have a launch manifest, and I'm going to schedule you to put your satellite up. But yeah, I guess my example is more of a blockade, a close blockade using physical force. I don't know. You'd actually have to impact a lot of allies and a lot of commercial companies to actually make that happen. Maybe if you consider spectrum, maybe jamming, right? maybe it's not really an embargo in a sense, but it's the same effect. I am denying your ability to send transmissions down through a blockade or jamming of your communication satellite. So it will look different, I have a feeling.
And what capabilities does Space Force actually have in this whole conversation? Because so far, we've talked about commercial entities, we've talked about foreign governments, we've talked about how we don't really have a regulatory structure in place to employ any of these capabilities in a deliberate national security way. What does Space Force actually do? And what should they be doing in all this?
So I'm thinking about Death Stars and destroyers in space.
Here we go.
And some transporters, and we can get to the moon and Mars via transporter. So what does the Space Force do? I mean, like other military branches, they organize, train, and equip for the space domain. Commanders present forces, so Space Force will present forces to U.S. Spacecom or U.S. Indo-PACOM for any type of wars. A lot of the stuff, hey, we don't have Space Force people flying around in space. We do have Space Force does have an astronaut, which is kind of cool, but they're acting in a NASA capacity, kind of like how we had in other ones. I don't see boots on the moon. I don't see a role for Space Force on the moon because, again, in the U.S., we consider that a civil function through NASA and the Artemis Accords. I will point out that our rivals, the People's Republic of China, has a very different way of viewing PLA, and the party are involved in everything, so they don't really make a distinguish between civil and military. So when they go to the moon, there's going to be PLA as part of those bases. So we have GSAP, which is like Space Force has, and this is open source, they're doing inspection of satellites in the geostationary belt. They have proliferated low Earth orbit constellations. We know we need missile warning systems. So if you look at the mission areas that space provides, missile warning. So whenever in the Cold War we're trying to prevent or try to detect intercontinental ballistic missiles coming to the U.S., nuclear command and control. We have the intelligence community still taking pictures in a highly exquisite way with a really good resolution. We have space-based weather, which is important. Of course, satellite communications. This isn't sexy stuff. I know. Nobody's blowing up each other's stuff at this point. For the last anti-satellite test conducted by the United States was from a Navy ship. It was a Standard Missile Block 3 special mod that launched and blew up one of our satellites that was leaking hydrazine, I believe it was, in Operation Burnt Frost. So we have to kind of fill in the gaps in our knowledge because not everything is readily available, but we're not shooting lasers or photon torpedoes at each other yet.
Well, it sounds like when it comes to space, there is a tremendous amount of capability that already exists in the private sector, and there's already a tremendous amount of interest and attention paid to it across the government. But it doesn't sound like Space Force is actually in a position, from nothing that I've seen or read, and you haven't mentioned anything yet, to harness or coordinate any of those efforts. And I think to a certain level, they'd actually need different authorities and permissions from Congress to step in and dictate to a SpaceX or whoever what they are and are not allowed to do in a time of emergency, and that'd be a very sticky political thing to navigate. So I still have to go back to the question, why do we have a Space Force at this point?
So I probably should correct my my poor explanation. The Space Force actually has a commercial space strategy. The U.S. Department of Defense has a DoD commercial integration strategy. For several years now, we've recognized that most of the innovation has been coming from the commercial sectors. They have economies of scale. Government systems are really expensive and take upwards of a decade to actually develop and field, where space companies can do those on the order of months, if sometimes even less than a year. So we know it's a strategic advantage on the U.S. side. So we want to take advantage. As like I said, we have all our launch capabilities commercial. Most of our satellite communications is commercial also. So the question is for some of the cool stuff like active debris removal, picking up pieces of junk in space and removing it. Is that a commercial entity, and does the government need to be an anchor customer? To your more pointed question is, why do we have a Space Force? What is the value? What the conclusion was, and there was a big, vigorous debate because the Department of the Air Force or the Air Force did a lot of these space functions. And we're not talking about kinetic operations on a day-to-day basis going on in space. The thinking is, and your audience may have their own opinion, it's best to have a cadre, a community that thinks about military operations in a specific domain to make it a specialty area, to think about the offense and defense in space. Formerly it was thinking about space and air. Hey, we can kind of muddle our way through. Sure, you can. But they've come a long way. I think they've been, since 2019. So we're about in our 5th year right now for Space Force. They're changing. They're trying to normalize. New is hard. They're trying to establish what a Space Force culture is, which is really hard if you're not combat proven and you don't have all these stories, like the Marines have. Good grief. The Marines will always tell you their stories of how they saved the world. But the Space Force doesn't really have this narrative of their relevance in times of conflict. So that'll come in time. As we try to separate all these domains into their own domain of conflict, sometimes it's troubling. You got to put those pieces back together into a joint force. But I do see benefit. They're coming out with their own doctrine. They're deviating from air power theory and air doctrine, which is good to see. Coming back to more the maritime analogy, which personally I find rewarding. Was that me or
That was
something
me.
else?
My power flashed out for a second, and the whole house recycled. So sorry about that.
Okay, that's okay.
No, you.
Well, I said something profound. I'm sure it was at the end.
Well, honestly, it's probably got captured on recording anyway. Because if your internet was so good, it would have still grabbed your stuff and uploaded it. But anyway, back to the conversation.
Yeah.
Where I cut out at was building a culture when you haven't been combat tested, or building an identity.
Yeah, I have you coming in and out, but I'll just, until the Space Force does have some combat experience in times of conflicts involving what we do in the U.S., and giving everyone a campaign ribbon or some type of thing, I think that'll come. I mean, other services have their histories. It's really difficult as the junior military service, which I know they don't want to be called, but that's just part of it. But they've made some strides, and I'm really happy if you look at some of their doctrine and their strategies. It's a lot of maritime inspiration there. So they're trying to understand that their role is more, probably has more relevance to a maritime approach than to an air power approach, which is a big change because that's, coming from the Department of the Air Force, it was just easy to say, hey, we're going to just use what we have in the Air Force to build our Space Force.
Gotcha. When it comes to, again, the maritime parallel, one of the unique things that the U.S. Navy did after World War II, when America became the global hegemon, well, arguably that didn't happen until after Soviet Union fell, depending on how you want to measure it. But one of the unique roles the U.S. Navy has played in the world since World War II is patrolling the sea lanes, making sure that everyone had access to commerce, really creating the modern era of globalization and trade. Mm-hmm. Does Space Force play a similar role? Is the American Space Force the hegemon in space that enforces the rules of the road and ensures equal access to space for all countries? Because it seems we can either follow that path and then small and medium-sized countries can participate in the space revolution, or it's just a straight-up competition, a zero-sum game between us and every other great power, in which case you're going to have a few players that dominate everything, no one else gets to play in the sandbox, and everyone gets a smaller slice of the pie. I cynically think number two is more likely, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think number two is more likely too if you look at historical experience. But I'm going to give you a reason for hope.
Give me some.
So, so based on Corbett's maritime strategy, the normal condition of the seas, the oceans of the world, was for, he called it command of the sea, so sea control. The normal condition was for command of the seas to be in dispute. So great powers competed over sea lines communication, port, trade. Only during when Britannia ruled the waves at the height of the British Empire was maybe that an exception. I think we're seeing an equivalent of when Britannia ruled the waves for us. U.S. is by far the biggest leader when it comes to space capabilities, and what we're doing. But I'll go back. History suggests the normal condition will be for space control, command of space to be in dispute. So when we consider what China and Russia are doing, or other middle powers, what we're trying to do in space, I think we're going to see competition, and we're going to see coercion, and we're going to see all the things, all our earthly woes playing out in space, because human beings can be horrible to each other. So, but how do I give hope? So in the maritime analogy, and the Space Force is wrestling with this identity crisis, is it a brown water Navy or is it a blue water Navy analogy? So brown water Navy, as you're aware, like in the riverine forces of Vietnam, navies supported forces ashore, whether it's putting Marines ashore, long-range artillery fire, moving stuff in, or riverine craft. But navies also had a role in blue water. This was naval fleet-on-fleet actions. Sometimes navies need to sink the enemy ships. For the Space Force, I wonder, and the main narrative is Space Force exists to support the terrestrial warfighter. Or should the Space Force exist to consider space-on-space military effects, offensive, defensive operations? And I tell the folks in the Space Force, the answer is the same that the Navy came up with. You got to do both. You don't get to pick one or the other. Your adversaries, you have to plan for a range of potential futures. The future is unknowable in any detail. And if you are strong in one area and weak in another, a rival is going to find that weakness and go after it. So Space Force, you can walk and chew gum. You can support the terrestrial warfighter. And then also think about what makes you unique is considering military effects against adversaries when they're threatening national security interests.
So it sounds like we need to get used to a world where there is a persistent level of competition in space, where we know we're going to be constantly poked in the eye by somebody. We have this approach to international relations as Americans in general, saying, the rules-based international order is an absolute good. Everyone should just follow the rules. And if you don't, even the slightest way, we have the right to go wreck your day however we feel at the time, depending on how froggy we're getting. how do we avoid that same type of either we pretend everything's good and there's nothing to worry about versus we're going all in and slapping everyone else in the face? How do we manage that in an environment like space where we can expect to have persistent competition that we don't want to get out of control, but we have to accept if we're going to reap the benefits of the domain?
Yeah. So your point is well taken on competition and coercion. It's hard to know all the details of what's going on in space, but competition and coercion has been going on in space for several years now. When I was a previous guest on your wonderful show, I talked about irregular warfare, and that was a good model for considering actions below the threshold of armed conflict or use of force per the United Nations Treaty. Because Western liberal democracies don't have a very good answer when it comes to coercion or competition. We understand when somebody's attacking us, we have the inherent right of self-defense, and we can escalate up and evoke treaty, collective security arrangements and the like. What's the way forward? It can't, instead of the U.S. has a history of being really lax and then we overreact, what's the way ahead? And we're kind of figuring this out. It's working with the international community more. We have the Artemis Accords, which, as we're going back to the moon, we're going to put return humans to the moon. We're working with our allies and partners. China has its version, the International Lunar Research Station, in competition. So we have different worldviews. In the West, we believe our worldview is better. I agree with this worldview. That's the world I want, more Western liberal democracies. But, we know we need our allies. Space is big, if not infinite. There's room for us all. But if you're going to shape what the future looks like, having more countries signing on to your vision is better. Last I counted, the Artemis Accords, they're bilateral agreements between the U.S. and individual countries sharing the same vision. I think we're about 36 countries, which is pretty good considering where we started. When we, this current administration about a year and a half ago promoted a voluntary ban on direct ascent, hit-to-kill anti-satellite testing that caused debris. We had 155 countries in the United Nations General Assembly that voted along with that. So there's a lot of countries that still look to the U.S. for leadership, even though we're sometimes erratic and fickle and begrudgingly take on that role. But occasionally we get it right, and we're reaching consensus on what we want in space. It's going to involve allies, and it's going to involve the commercial sector too.
So with that, with countries looking to us for leadership, we have papered over that reality with this notion of shared values and the Western world order and liberal democracy's inherent good and all that. But we've also been the biggest stick on the block for a very long time. So I question how much we can rely on future treaties to drive cooperation in deconflict space, and how much of this needs to rely on our willingness and ability to astutely apply coercive techniques to deter adversaries. Obviously, the answer is always you want both, but I feel like one of those actually matters, and the other one is a way to justify a budget to the American public.
Yeah, justifying the budget is important here. So to your point, is it the carrot or the stick? And the conclusion most reaches, it has to be a combination of both. And maybe that scale changes depending on terrestrial events. We've cooperated with Russia with their space program for decades, and what has it gotten us, right? We still see Russian aggression against Western democracies. So is it all for naught? Is all this just a waste of time? When we consider competition and what's going on with China, that's an important question too. Should we seek cooperation in some form with China? Or we just say, hey, our worldviews are so different, there's no way to reconcile them. I think leaders lead. Even though it may not look ideal, we have to try to actually reach out to our rivals, even though we disagree. And why, even if we know Xi and Putin are not going to change their mind, our friends and allies see that and see that we've tried and have used soft power diplomacy to try to solve this issue. And this helps keep your friends on your side. It helps form a coalition quicker in times of conflict. So I on the stick side, we do need to have a big stick, whether it's peace through strength, deterrence by denial of punishment, or imposing cost. You need to have that tool in your toolbox. Hopefully not use it. But that's fundamental to our deterrence approach. But I'm an optimist. So you remember in the Cold War, nuclear weapons and stuff like that. Thank you. I'm going to knock on some big wood. We never saw all the devastation that could have happened from the Cuban Missile Crisis or like. So maybe we won't see conflict in space, but I think we need to prepare for it and realize our rivals are going to push us any way they can and find our weaknesses.
Well said. If you had to put your finger on the number one mistake that we need to avoid making to effectively use the space domain as a tool of national power, what is it that, as we are actually a few days away from election, new administration is going to be coming in? What does this new administration, no matter who it is, what's the one thing they need to not do to give us a chance at getting this right?
I'd go back. It's the number one mistake I've been seeing for years. And no matter what I say, we can't seem to get over it. As Americans, we mirror image. We don't read books. We don't study the histories and cultures of our rivals. Whenever I talk or teach, I remind folks, the West and China and Russia have very different approaches to deterrence. What is acceptable cost? Putin will put his people into the meat grinder, and that is consistent with Russian thinking going back decades, if not 100 years. This idea of the lose-lose. I lose, but you lose more, so I will just continue doing that. That is just not the way we think in the West. We like to think of the win-win. China has a different understanding of deterrence. It's more of compellence. So in the West, we think of dissuasion. I'm going to have peace through strength and all this capability, and I will prevent your military actions. PRC can be, I'm going to use military actions, hit you softly, to compel you to back down. In the West, we say, I was just attacked. I have the inherent right of self-defense. And then so you have, the danger is you have two countries that did not want to have large-scale conflict because they're just talking past each other, and their worldviews, the cultural understanding, the historical experience is totally different. So not everyone thinks like us. Let's pick up an old book and read it and see what we can learn.
Well said. It is somewhat ironic that the more we move into outer space, the more it highlights the problems that we have back down here on Earth.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, I think that's bringing us to the top of our time. But if folks want to go out and get your book and understand a bit more about what's going on up there, where can they find your work?
At all major bookstores online or whatever like that. Amazon, it's a Routledge book. There might be a discount if you go to the Routledge site too, but it's available. It could be at your doorstep in a couple of days, I'm told.
Awesome. And that is Space Warfare, the 2nd edition, correct?
That is correct.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking some time this afternoon to talk with us. Really appreciate your insight, sir.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me on again.